once you become a minister, it's less about politics and more about governing. And I think if I look at the Morrison time and the Abbott time, they didn't trust public servants. They didn't trust organisations. I think that was inherent weakness in their government. That if you don't trust the public service and then you're in charge of running it, what do you do?
Welcome to the Westminster Tradition podcast, where we unpack lessons for the public service, starting with the Robo-Debt Royal Commission. My name is Danielle Elston of Good Government Advisory, and today I'm joined by Caroline Crozer-Barlow, who is now a recovering public servant. Hello, Caroline.
Hello, Danielle.
Today we have a very special guest with us who's going to help us unpick many of the things we've talked about in relation to the relationship between a minister and their department. And he knows it so well that he wrote the book on it. Former South Australian Minister John Hill joins us today. Welcome, John.
Thanks. Nice to be with you.
I'm going to start with your bio from the University of South Australia website because, quite frankly, it is one of the best bios I've seen. John Hill was born in Sydney in 1949, and after completing an arts degree at Sydney University and dropping out of law, which all good people do, John, I am one of them, hitchhiked to Adelaide in 1974. Despite being told by his father, an oil company executive, that he couldn't get a job because of his shoulder-length hair and beard, on arrival in Adelaide, he took up a position as a high school teacher with the Department for Education. While enjoying teaching very much, John soon realised his passion was politics, and before long he cut that hair and became an activist in the Teachers' Union. That led to a stint as an advisor to the Education Minister, State Secretary of the Labor Party, and ultimately member of the State Parliament in the Southern Suburbs electorate of Kaurna. During this time, John did complete that law degree at Adelaide University, something Caroline and I never did. During John's parliamentary career from 1997, he was Opposition Shadow Minister for Environment until Labor was elected in 2002. From which date until 2013, he served in a number of ministerial roles, including Environment and Conservation, Minister for Health for quite a long time, and Assistant Minister for the Arts. John retired from Cabinet in 2013 and Parliament in 2014 and is now enjoying his third encore career on various boards as Deputy Chancellor of the University of South Australia and Chair of Private Healthcare Australia, the Jam Factory, and member of the board of a human research ethics organisation, Bellbury. Oh, that's quite a bio there, John, so we are very grateful to have you today.
Well, you accumulate things as you get older. That's what it's about, Danielle.
You quite literally wrote the book on being a minister, John, which we're going to link in the show notes, which is not a diary of your political exploits and disputes, but almost a manual on how to be a minister, with the kind of chapter titles that excite bureaucrats like us, like paper and bureaucracy and policy. Just to start us off, why did you write on being a minister with such a focus on the operations of being a minister?
Well, to be frank, I did start thinking about writing a how-to book, and I guess that's what comes through, because I thought after I'd retired, and I'd been in the job for quite a long time, all the things that I'd learnt would disappear, because I know people who go into politics are very nervous about asking anybody for help because it might come out that they're not perfect. And so I thought if I wrote something that could be referenced, then people could read it in the privacy of their own rooms and perhaps learn a few things. And I know from various people in government on both sides, politics on both sides, that it has been read and been helpful, I hope.
I think it has been. I've handed it out on a couple of occasions. I'm not sure everybody read it though. We saw a lot of evidence in the Robo-Debt Royal Commission that perhaps not everyone understood the various roles and responsibilities, and there were a whole series of blurred lines from minister and department. Caroline, for John's benefit and a refresher for our listeners, remind us how they managed the new policy proposal that built Robo-Debt and it was developed and signed off.
Yeah, so look, and I'm not sure how closely you followed Robo-Debt, John.
Just like any other member of the public, I think. I didn't follow it in any particular detail, but it was astonishing as it unfolded.
Yeah, it was one of those gifts that kept on giving in the worst possible way. Look, so Danielle has alluded that I am particularly nerdily interested in the process by which the thing was approved, because even as it was approved, it turned out some parts of the government knew that it was unlawful. And what I find fascinating about the way this new policy proposal went to ERC and then to Cabinet was how little the minister saw, and yet Commissioner Holmes in the Robodebt Royal Commission really holds Minister Morrison accountable. So if you don't mind, I'll take you through it in a couple of spots. So it starts with Minister Morrison getting in, and he's like, I'm going to be a tough welfare cop on the beat, and he chats with his agency heads, both social security, social services and human services, and is very clear with them that he's looking for budget savings from this portfolio. And so he sends off the head of human services to go come up with a proposal, and she returns that sort of says, look, we can recover all these debts via averaging, and included in that minute is some anodyne language that they're going to need legislative and policy change. So the minister sees that and says, right, yep, proceed. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? You get a piece of advice, it's like, go have a look. Yeah. Worth saying this is at the time in which everything is stuck in the Senate from the horror Joe Hockey budget, and so that the legislative change piece was a problem for them. But it's never said out loud. They can't see it in any of the conversations, but it's clearly a thing that the public servants are thinking. Then the MPP comes back to Minister Morrison to sign in, and there's no mention of legislative change at all. And there's a little box ticked that says, has the Australian Government Solicitor assessed the constitutional and legislative authority risk? Yes, and it's ticked yes. And so they just kind of like, okay, must be fine. So Minister Morrison lodges the MPP in Cabinet and says, oh yeah, we don't need legislative change. Now, they did need legislative change, and what Commissioner Holmes says is that Minister Morrison misled Cabinet because he didn't ask the question, what changed? Why did we go from needing legislation to not needing it now? Now, I have very little sympathy for Minister Morrison in this conversation, but it is, don't you think that's a high bar, that when you get one piece of advice that says legislative change might be required, and then the next thing you get says you think it doesn't say you need it anymore. How do you feel about him being held accountable for that by Commissioner Holmes?
Well, it seems to me a bit tough. I mean, like you, I didn't care very much for Scott Morrison or his attitude to governance generally, but he relied on a departmental head. He went to the department with a set of, I guess, attitudes / policy kind of outcomes that he was looking for, and he said, how do we achieve this? They came back with a package, and it had a particular set of advice associated with that package. They came back, did more work. Some of those recommendations had changed. He may have questioned, they may have had a discussion about it, but in good faith he took it to Cabinet. It then goes through the Cabinet process of Attorney Generals and Treasury, and everybody else has a look at it. Nobody else picks it up. It's a bit rough to say that Scott Morrison is the only one really responsible, I think. So it seems like a whole failure of the government system that produced that outcome.
But does that position rely on you assuming he is operating in good faith? And I don't want to speculate about the nature of the relationship that he particularly had with his secretaries, but can't you imagine a circumstance where that relationship between the minister and the secretary is such that it's kind of a thing we know we don't talk about? Like, do you think that that's something you could hold a minister accountable for creating a sense of fear of being able to tell these things?
I think that's the one explanation, that he went in there, thumping the table and saying, I want this, I want it now, and they came up with something which possibly wasn't thought through properly, or that they didn't agree with, and he jumped on it. He thought it was a clever idea. I mean, common sense tells you that what they were proposing was nonsense. I mean, it just didn't need a Cabinet submission to work that out. And the fact that the whole Cabinet agreed to it says a lot about the people sitting around the Cabinet and the people advising them. But I mean, I've seen it amongst colleagues that some ministers have a much more bullying kind of style, and they want more deference from their heads of department. To me, a minister, you get elected on a political platform, there's no doubt about that. But when you form government, you really, to a large degree, are not being overtly political. politics is behind everything, but you're really about governance and government. You've got a platform, you've got policies, you've got outcomes you want, and you work with the department to achieve those outcomes. It's not about the who's the biggest person around the room. It really needs to be. It should be like a marriage, really. The head of the department and the minister are in this kind of close relationship, and it relies on trust and humour and good attitude. And if you don't have that, then it's never going to work. I mean, I think I said in my book, there's only one person that a minister can sack, and that's the head of the department. And if they work out they can't get on with them, they should sack them and get somebody else.
Oh, I love that. And I'm also just loving the idea that you can just get divorced like that.
It is a relationship of trust, I think. That it has to be one of trust. You have to be able to talk about everything and get the feedback from the departmental head that says, this is total nonsense, Minister. What you're suggesting can't be done, or it shouldn't be done. And it's okay to push back and have a to and fro. And sometimes you have to say, I remember at various times when I first became a minister, I went in with policy that had been agreed to, we put to the public, and the department didn't like some elements of it. And I said, I'm sorry, but this is our policy. Whether you like it or not, this is what we're going to do. And they always do it. I mean, they tell you why they thought it was wrong, but that's fine, as long as it's open and, it's clear about why you're doing it. Other times when things weren't so public-facing, ministers would take advice all the time and largely do what the department suggests because they've got the wisdom of how to make the thing work.
I think that's interesting, and you were in Cabinet for a long time, John, and the other thing that happened during the Royal Commission was minister after minister saying everything that goes to Cabinet has been legaled, or and a lack of understanding of the difference between, for instance, the cabinet process going through Attorney Generals versus actual Crown advice, which is a completely different thing.
Yeah.
And it was I have not worked in Cabinet Office, but most people in my orbit have spent a lot of time there. And there was a lot of kind of flurry of text messages saying, how do all these ministers not understand what the process that gets something to Cabinet entails? And I think part of it was lots of changes in portfolio. Like no one was a minister in one place for a long time. But it does kind of come to that, how much do you understand what advice you're getting when you're putting it to Cabinet? Do you know what you do?
Well, the head of
do you
Prime
know where it's
Ministers should have been able to assist in this, you'd think. I do think it's interesting. Some portfolios become entry-level portfolios, and ministers can't wait to get out of them. They do have a lot of churn. Others, like health, nobody wants to be a minister for health. So if you get there, you tend to stay there forever. And others, like Treasury, people, really want to hold on to those kind of portfolios. So some of these, where the accidents happen, I think it can be because there is a lot of churn, and probably at a bureaucratic level as well as a ministerial level. So, you don't get necessarily the people staying around and understanding it that well.
I remember a friend of mine who worked at corrections told me that she'd had 7 ministers in 8 years or something similar, and that's a big portfolio in South Australia. But another friend of mine who worked at DFAT said that Catherine Campbell, when she was at DFAT, had spoken quite openly to staff about how she had, in her roles in human services, been a secretary whose job it was to kind of provide advice and support to incoming ministers, and give them that kind of induction of how to be a minister and what that looks like. I'm so interested. Did you ever feel that the public service ever supported you in learning how to be a minister, or was it all the other way?
A mixture, I guess. I mean, I was lucky. You mentioned in my bio that I worked as a ministerial assistant to a minister in the Bannon government, Greg Crafter, who was the Minister for Education, and he asked me to work for him because I knew about education, I knew about the politics of education. So I learnt, I had an on-the-job training very closely linked to a minister who did a good job, and I was there for 3 years, and he in turn had been a ministerial assistant to Don Dunstan when Don had been, and so there were learnings there that go all the way back, and I remember Greg saying to me that one of Don's great strengths was that he'd be out in his electorate regularly talking to ordinary people who had problems, and he was able then to universalise those issues to make changes in the way government operated to the benefit not just the constituents but more broadly the population that they represented. And I thought that was a pretty interesting thing. Greg also used to say to the heads of the department, I've got three priorities: my family, my electorate and this department. I'm not too sure that the time was allocated along those lines, but I thought it was quite important to, and he always had a very good open relationship with his ministers. I was surprised as a novice working in his department how open he was. And so when I became a minister, I had that preparation of being in a ministerial office, so I felt advantaged compared to some of my colleagues who just walked straight in from other areas. Often people get criticised in politics or government that, you get into politics early, you work for a minister, then you become one, you never really see the real world. But that's true too. But I think it's not a bad thing to have had an apprenticeship as you go through. But my first head of department was Alan Holmes, who was the head of the Environment Department. He'd been appointed by the opposition parties, and he was very helpful to me setting up an office. And he said to me, look, this person would be a great person to help set up your office. Carolyn Lee is her name. She'd been appointed by the opposition as well. And she stayed with me for 11 years, and I think she's still running the Minister of Health's office now. But she was just brilliant at doing it, just getting the machinery. Well, I had the best organised office. The paperwork just flowed. You talked about paper and how you get excited as a public servant. It flowed through our office. She was very skillful at getting the good people to work in the office, getting stuff done really well. So I never worried about the machinery that was behind me as a minister. And Alan, as I said, the head of the department, was very helpful in getting the right people to start that process off.
Tenure in minister's office seems to be, I don't know if it's the 24-hour news cycle but those people with 11 years experience, and that was working for you, and she had worked up for your predecessor, so she had more than that.
Yeah.
I think they're becoming less common, partly to do with that churn and burn of the 24-hour news cycle and just that complete access to all your documents 24 hours a day with remote working, and it's very hard for people to last that long. And I noticed that the tenure is getting a bit shorter, not due to anything, I think, other than the fact that the jobs are getting bigger and more intense over time. And I a huge admiration for the amount of work involved to make a minister's office run like clockwork.
I am too. So I always felt I had really good staff. I felt very blessed as a minister. I had very good heads of department whose relationships I had with them were always good, and I had very good personal staff around me, both bureaucratic, public servicey sort of staff and political staff in my office.
John, you said before there's only one appointment that you can... the one appointment that you're in charge of, and that's that of the Secretary or Chief Executive or Director General. We're a very national and international podcast,
right.
So all of the heads of departments have different names. Right. We previously have interviewed Secretaries Sue Varden and Andrew Podger on this podcast, who have talked about the same things, the different relationships. You have written and talked about the appointment process, which is quite different in this jurisdiction. Andrew Podger has advocated that at the Australian government level, the return of tenure for secretaries and the appointment processes to be run by kind of a combination of the head of PM&C and maybe the Public Service Commissioner. You're pretty comfortable with that minister premier appointment, and then that capacity to say this isn't working out, like let's find someone else. Can you tell us more about how that can be done, how you can have that kind of contract-based appointment and avoid politicisation and ensure that they can tell you things you don't want to hear without fearing that their pink slip is kind of pending?
Yeah, they're very difficult issues. I think back, I'm old enough to remember the Menzies government, which was in for 23 years. And at the end of that time, all the senior public servants had tenure, unlimited tenure. We're talking about they've all got tenure, but they're limited these days, had unlimited tenure, and they'd all been chosen by Conservative governments over a period of time, so they had a culture that was highly conservative. So when Whitlam became Prime Minister, he was stymied by the bureaucracy, which was looking in a particular set of directions. He had to do something about it. And so, I think I learned at that stage it's really important that you have good quality public servants, but they don't necessarily reflect the views of the government of the day, but they're at least open to the views of the government of the day. And if they're hostile to the views of the government of the day, or just not capable of seeing that there's an alternative to what they've grown up with, then there's going to be a problem, So I think that's my basic position. In terms of the appointments I've made, I did get rid of a departmental head before I took over. Not that there was anything particularly wrong with him, but just didn't think it was the right person for the job that I wanted done. But I always use the head of the public service board, or the equivalent, to do the selection process and the interview process and make a recommendation to me. Usually in the case of the health secretary, I had an external party both times that I got to choose I had the public service people plus outsiders who I trusted, and they made recommendations to me in a particular way. One of them we tested a bit and then didn't agree with the appointment that was recommended and went elsewhere. We went to their second on their list. It was largely, I think, because in that particular case, if I can be really frank, the external people thought I would be a better fit with the person they first chose. Not that there was anything wrong with the first person or the second person, but they thought we'd be more personally aligned. And I thought that was an interesting and odd thing. In fact, and it was true, I probably would have been more like that person, he would have been more like me. But the person I chose, we ended up choosing, was quite our conversations could be quite argumentative at times. Argumentative, but we'd debate things, and we had a very good personal relationship, but we were different types of people who saw things in a different way, and it was a sort of yin and yang that kind of worked, I thought.
I think that goes to that tension of everybody having potentially a different opinion, and ministers hearing that there might be not quite enough money, or hearing different parts of advice, and keeping the emotional regulation to be able to have the tension between different advice and a conversation, instead of expecting to receive everything pre-cut to your satisfaction, that there can be no tension anymore. In some ways, I think that's part of the question is that it's fine to debate and decide with your CE, and it's fine to throw those things backwards and forwards, and we might be losing some of those skills of having your advice tested and being comfortable with the minister saying, hang on a second, what about another way? And then having the confidence to say, oh, Minister, I'm sorry, I hear you and I'm testing all those ideas, but there are other reasons.
Yes.
We might be losing some of our capacity to have difficult debate conversations as we try and land positions.
Well, I can't really talk for what it's like now, to be honest. I've been out for a dozen years, but I know from the better ministers, I think, always had very good, robust relationships with their CEOs, and chose CEOs who were capable of thinking broadly and working hard and all those kind of things. But it's also the structures you put in place. You have regular meetings. I know various times I talked to public servants and discover that they didn't meet regularly with their ministers, and you think, well, how can you run a department if you don't see them every week? So, I used to have a structured arrangement with the heads of the department, particularly in health, where there was so much happening. Every week the CEO and I would meet. I'd have my chief of staff or another advisor there. He would have a similar arrangement. We'd bring in other people from the agency who might be reporting on different things, and we'd have a structured agenda of the things that were happening, things that he thought I needed to know, things that I was looking to achieve, and we'd just build up an agenda and work through it. Notes would be kept, and follow-up would occur, and sometimes it couldn't happen, sometimes it did. I mean, just on that point of advice too, one of the most frustrating things I found as a minister is when advice had come up and it didn't make a recommendation. It'd say the minister could do this or the minister could do that, or, you could do this or you could do that. I don't care what it is you're recommending. You've got to tell me what you think, And if I don't like it, I can tell you what I think. But unless I know what you think, you're putting it all onto the minister. And I think there's sometimes a bit of cowardice, that's perhaps too strong a word, but uncertainty in public servants. And it worried me that they wouldn't commit to something. They either hadn't thought it through properly, or they were worried that I might not like it, and they're looking for approval. I mean, I must say that it didn't happen with the CEOs, but sometimes things would come up from beneath, beneath the CEO level, and you'd get that sort of vagueness of recommendation.
We have talked about before providing options, even the options that might be unpalatable or that you don't recommend, so that the minister can see the full suite.
Always, do nothing is always an option.
And that it's perfectly acceptable for the minister to say, I saw them all and you recommended option 2. I'm going with number 1 based on everything you've said. And that, again, culturally, we want to make sure we don't end up in a culture where they all go up like that, John. They all go up blank. Here are your 3 options, but I won't tell you what I think, for fear of not wanting to box you in or having to use your capacity, your authority to say, I'm not going to go with the one that you've recommended.
Well, even worse, like I recall a time after an election where I was asked to write a minute up about implementing an election commitment, and it was an election commitment that cut directly against a thing that we had advised the previous government to do differently, right? So we've been on this kind of difficult thing, doing this difficult thing, and then the election commitment is, no, we're not going to do it. And someone in my team had sort of written this thing that said, we recommend that you do the election commitment. And I was like, I just actually in good faith cannot write down that I recommend that. I'm definitely happy to say, for these reasons, we had previously recommended this, and in light of your election commitment on these different factors, this is my recommendation about how to take it forward in a risk-managed way. And people were aghast that I would say to a minister, incoming minister, that I didn't recommend it. And I'm like, I think he knows. I think he saw what we were doing before. And I think he'll think I'm a goose if I'm suddenly recommending that this is the best way forward. But how would you take that kind of advice? Would you?
Well, I think if you're very clear about what the policy is as a government, you want recommendations that tell you how to implement that policy. If you're saying what should the policy be, then clearly you'd recommend a particular policy. I think a classic example in South Australia was when the government changed after the 2016 election. The incoming Liberal government had promised that the trams that were going along King William Road would turn right into North Terrace. Yes. The former government had said that's not possible. All the technical advice is it can't be done. I would love to have seen what the departmental advice was to the incoming minister about that proposition. They kept at it for a while, but eventually they had to see common sense and it was dropped as an idea. So, these things happen. I had a case when I was Environment Minister. I was planning to construct a new agency which would be land, water and biodiversity, bringing them together in a particular way. I got to say, the head of the department didn't like that idea at all. And, he was telling me why I shouldn't do it, but he agreed that I had the right to do it and he facilitated. But, I didn't expect him to like it. I knew he wouldn't.
As long as you implement in good faith to the very, very, very best of your abilities.
Absolutely.
As I said, as you sometimes have to say to quite activist staff members, if you don't like it, run for Parliament.
Exactly.
And the same applies to senior public servants, which is that doesn't mean you don't give good advice as to the reasons why there might be gaps or holes or risks in it, but you always implement to the absolute best of your capability.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I mean, one of the things that I used to, I think I've written about this too, that used to disturb me a bit is that sometimes, not at the top level of the public service, but people who are running policy areas who I knew were involved in the Labor Party but also in Parliament had come in and sort of wanted to be a political agenda that they were promoting. And I said, oh, thank you. I don't want your political views. Not in this environment anyway.
No.
Well, that's a beautiful segue. So how do you tell good advice from bad? How did you, as you're receiving all this advice from public servants, how do you know?
Well, I guess you've got to go. You start off with your own policy, your own strategic position, and that was something I was always interested in. So when I went as in the Environment Department, I spent 4 years as a shadow minister, talking and thinking and coming up with a platform. When I became Health Minister, I went from being Environment Minister to Health Minister without having thought about anything, much. So in relation to the portfolio,
of course,
other than I could see that needed some help. So I had different ways of doing it. In the first, I had a clear set of things that I wanted to be done, and I said to the department, these are the things, tell me how to do them. In health, I said, we've got all these problems. How do we fix these problems? Tell me what the strategy should be. And they came up with a strategy, which largely I spent the next 6 or 7 years implementing. It was the construction of a new hospital, investment in a lot of other hospitals, changing relationships between the centre and the elements that, I won't go through all the detail, but it was largely... It was my instinct that we needed to do something big to fix it, and then the agency came up with the strategy to do it, and that became my platform. But sometimes, though, and I'll give you one example, and largely, politics is in the back of your mind, I suppose, as a minister. How will this play out in public? Closing down the Royal Adelaide Hospital wasn't an easy... I thought building a new hospital would be easy. Closing an old one down was going to be hard, and as it turned out, that was pretty true. Mm-hmm. But sometimes you have to do things and you work out how you use the capital and how you explain it and so on. But sometimes, there was one example I wrote about in my book too, about... we digitised the breast screening technology. It used to be a wet process, a photograph was taken and developed, and then, in due course, somebody would look at it and write back to the woman and say whether or not there was something that needed further investigation. And they digitised it, so it's a much faster and easier process. And then when they checked the performance of digitisation against the wet screen, there was a lower number of cases that had been identified. So the advice was, we don't think it's just coincidence, there must be an issue here. And the question was whether there's people reading the equipment or the people or the technology itself, or, they weren't sure how it was. And their way of dealing with it, and they've been going on for a couple of years, so I don't know how many thousands of cases were, their way of dealing with it was to take a sample of all of the screens and double check them to see whether or not the anomaly was a real one or not. And I thought that, that was perfectly sensible, prudent, scientifically based advice. But I thought politically it was a disaster, because it would mean that the 10,000 people or whoever being checked would get assurance, but the 100,000 who hadn't been checked would be very nervous. So I said, no, we've got to check everybody and, do it that way. And we worked out the strategy. They obviously agreed that I had the right to insist on it, but I just had a gut feeling that, and my political staffers were saying the same thing, we can't do this. So we worked it up, and I went out and with the head of the breast screen South Australia, and we explained it all, and we got thank you letters from people because of what we were doing. So, it was partly my instinct, but it was partly the fantastic person who was in charge of breast screening who was able to explain why and how we were doing it.
But I love, you call it politics, but sometimes I think politics is the code for ignoring scale and remembering that every decision impacts each individual individually. And that's the part of that story, right? Yes, scientifically, blah, blah, whatever. But every individual who had a breast screen, exactly as you say, had a feeling about that breast screen and then needed a different feeling about that breast screen as a result of it. And so I often think that politics is the place where the human really returns. And certainly when you work in a department, it is often the place where, a ministerial advisor is often the person to shame a junior policy officer into remembering that there's a human on the end of that quite turdy letter that they're sending back. Can you talk? But the flip side of that is that sometimes ministerial officers are a little bit too responsive to, hard luck stories or whatever. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that dance of the personal story and how much they can really shape the activity of an agency?
Yeah, well, that's true. Often it's backbenchers or also potentially ministers. Worse if it's a minister in a marginal seat who's very nervous and every single vote counts, and they will. That's part of your job as a local member of parliament. I did it all the time. I wrote hundreds of letters, thousands of letters over my time on behalf of individuals to ministers saying, can you review this? Can you check this? Can you do something differently? And that's part of your job. And you bring that comes those letters from ministers or letters from members of parliament from whichever side do get a priority in a ministerial office. They're not necessarily fast-tracked, though I imagine they are, but they're given a higher level of scrutiny, and I certainly always wanted to write back and see what the answer was. And, if you can help somebody, why wouldn't you? Often it's not really possible, and you explain why, but generally, and that shouldn't be because it's from a member of parliament, it should be anybody. And I think it's easy sometimes just to, if you're dealing with a lot of paper and you just tick a box and say, well, thank you very much for your letter. We've looked at it and, bugger off.
Yeah. Computer says no, I think that's right. The answer.
Yeah, I think you've got to always try. And that's the point I made before when I was saying when I was working for Greg, that's what he used to say about Dunstan. Dunstan's great skill, because he had a marginal seat for a very long time. He was able to take the particular and turn it into the general in a way which helped a lot of people. I think that was motivating for me as a theme, if you like, philosophy.
That also is that thing about mistakes as well, and how transparent one can be or should be, how hypersensitive. So it is possible, in my view, and I think Peter Beattie I've said this a couple of times before, was the absolute master at it. It is possible to not throw your public service under the bus and also acknowledge that mistakes happen, decisions are not made in accordance with a delegated authority. And that, again, that tension between sometimes we get it wrong as public servants and sometimes the minister finds that through a complaints process and the media or a talkback caller, and there is a way to be transparent about it, get up, fix it, without necessarily doing my department got it all wrong, gosh, they're a bit hopeless. And so because you can see that happens, you see it go in that direction, and then you see it in the other direction, which is the arms crossed and the nothing wrong with everything my department does, we're all right. And I think you talk a bit about complaints, and health is a portfolio, just the sheer number of people who use the system, and the risks of that system. You're in a system where stuff goes wrong. How, when you were hearing from those people, again, this podcast has largely been about robo-debt, and what happened was there was lots of complaints that weren't being heard, lots of reviews in a tribunal, but no one was counting them or reviewing them. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't actually until a person known to a staffer got one of these letters that they started to go, oh, well, maybe these letters aren't correct, maybe because they knew the person. How did you're talking about that, turning the individual into the systemic, and how did you, in a portfolio like health where lots of people do have bad days and it's a volume area like Centrelink, it's very voluminous, how did you know that you were catching all the big risks, not the risk where someone dropped it by accident that morning, but the big systemic ones?
Well, Yeah, there's lots of processes in place. I mean, health has got so much scrutiny. There's a health ombudsman, there's a health visitor, there's the AMA and the Nurses Union and the College of Psychologists and the College of Midwifery and the college. There's lots of structure and the human consumer organisations, and every body part has a consumer organisation focused on it. The kidney and brain and heart, and they all have.
That's so true.
They all have, and they all want to see the minister, so they come and see you regularly, and they tell you things, and you listen and try and respond, and then you get all of the direct phone calls and letters and emails now. All of that comes in. So I made sure all of those things were documented, and I'd see summaries of things that would come in, and if I thought something was particularly out of the ordinary, I'd ask more questions about it, and my senior staff would do the same. And it was lots of ways of checking it. But I mean, in health, I'm not sure how many health interactions the department and its hospitals would have every year, but let's say 1 million. You only need 1% of those to have an issue, and you got
absolutely
10,000 letters. I mean, it's probably only 0.1. You still get 1,000 issues. And then some of them, the first port of call is not me or the department, but the opposition or the media, and then you get the question being asked in Parliament or by a journalist, and you're standing in the middle of an interview, and the journalist asks you about something you've got no idea, and then you look like an idiot. And so it's difficult, but what you can do is say, I'm not aware of that, and I'll get the information for you. But, some things do go wrong. Sometimes people in the system do behave badly, and they need to be brought to account. But generally it's not deliberate. It's, usually... I mean, there was one stage, I think I had the department had 2 or 3 issues around wrong dosing for radioactive medicine. Yeah. And they seemed to come on top of each other, but they were just different events, but they just coalesced. So it looked like the department and the minister were completely incompetent when it came to this sort of area, and it was just really bad luck and bad timing. And the problems were fixed, and they weren't part of a systemic thing. They were just issues. So there's always going to be stuff like that. You just got to deal with it.
You'll find your successor in the environment portfolio would say the same thing about water pipes bursting.
Exactly right. There's always going to be a burst water pipe. That's right.
That's right. Sometimes it's not systemic, but you notice it. I think one of the things we talked about in relation to robodebt is that the ministers in question, because they were from the coalition, did not have strong relationships with some of the key stakeholders. So like ACOS or the single Parents Society or any of these kind of, because some of those associations had come in from the left wing, right? And so there was kind of a challenge in the political landscape to hear people from the other side, even though they were important stakeholders. I mean, I guess maybe there's a similar dynamic with the AMA in the health portfolio for Labor, I don't know. But like, how do you hear across cultural and kind of baked in political lines?
Look, I think this is a really important question, and it goes to the point I made before. I think that once you become a minister, it's less about politics and more about governing. And I think if I look at the Morrison time and the Abbott time, they made a lot about the so-called woke agenda and creating enemies of people who had leftish views. It was a culture wars. John Howard started it. It was all about the culture wars. They didn't trust public servants. They didn't trust organisations. I think that was their starting point. I think that was inherent weakness in their government. That if you don't trust the public service and then you're in charge of running it, what you do, you build up workarounds. So you get lots of consultants in, or you get political staffers who are more bolshy than they might otherwise would be. I mean, I think at least in the Labor side, or at least on my side, I was a teacher. I was a public servant. I understand how it works, and they're not all highly paid individuals who've got big agendas. They're just wage earners who are trying to do the best thing they can. So I think that's a fairly significant attitudinal difference, I think, that occurred. I've forgotten where that point was going. You might remind me where we were going with that.
Oh, it's particularly that thing, I think, John, of being able to pick up the phone. Again, we've talked about the noise
right.
and the number of complaints. And so you use the radiography. It's that capacity to pick up the phone and say to a stakeholder who's representing a big group, I'm hearing a bit of this from the department, a bit of that from the department. I'm hearing this on the radio. Can you tell me what you think is going on as a key user or a representative of consumers or whatever else? And if you don't have that capacity, you're missing basically one big funnel of important information, whether they are your people, in inverted commas, or not. Often the middle ground is where the answers are anyway for most people. And so if you can't talk to stakeholders who aren't yours, and I don't really like the language, but I can't come up with something better. How did you go about with the ones that weren't yours? I mean, they don't have to name them. We don't need to know who they were.
I'm happy to do that. No, I'll give you a very good example. When I became health minister, the previous health minister had got into a bit of a slanging match with the head of the AMA and the Australian Medical Association. It was a fractious kind of relationship. So I thought, well, the thing I need to do is develop a good relationship. So I set up a meeting first week and I decided to go out to the AMA headquarters rather than have them come into my office. And I said, well, okay, tell me the problems. What do you want fixed? And they gave me half a dozen things and I went and did most of them because they were reasonable. And, and the department said that'll cost more money. And I said, look, find the money. That's not a lot. And so we did 4 or 5 things. So they were very sensible, clever suggestions. And I then met with the AMA, I can't remember whether it's monthly or bi-monthly now, but on a regular basis. Half the times they'd come to me and half the times I would go to them. And I did the same thing with the nurses union, even though they were allegedly more on our side. And I did the same thing with the consumers. So I met all of them on a regular basis. And at the much to the chagrin of the Liberal Party, at the 2006 election, the AMA rated our policy and performance at a higher rate than the opposition. It would be a bit like the trade union movement supporting the Liberals. It was devastating for them. It was one of the highlights of my life to see the reaction. But it was because I'd worked with them, and so I maintained that relationship with the AMA over the whole time. We always had a good, respectful, open relationship. And if there were things they didn't like or didn't want to happen, they'd tell me and I'd explain why we were doing what we were doing. And we worked together and it was fine. And there's all the colleges too. I didn't meet with them quite as frequently, but I did meet with them on a reasonably regular basis, and the nurses union too. And sometimes that was fraught too because they had industrial issues which they wanted to pursue. And the consumers equally had, their issues. You just have to be available.
Did your cabinet colleagues, I don't know quite how to ask this question, but, you're a very moderate and reasonable minister, and, just saying I've worked in agencies that had you as minister and, they still spoke so fondly of the Minister Hill days. But I wonder, those olive branches that you put out to people who might otherwise be your political enemies, I wonder, did that ever cost you or did you ever feel you had to explain that to, maybe not your cabinet colleagues, but to your party colleagues, because you are between these two worlds?
No, I don't think. I think it was just understood that it was just good politics. I mean, what do they say? Keep your friends close and keep your enemies closer. But I didn't really see them as enemies, to be honest. But but they could easily have turned into enemies, and you just need to. I mean, there were some individual doctors who were very strident and very aggressive, and who told lies. It was impossible to do. It's impossible to deal with people who don't come with goodwill. I think that's the difference. But most people have got goodwill, and when you're a minister, even if you're from the other side of politics, from the way the person might vote, you still get some respect. It's not completely trashed. When the Liberals were in government here over the last 4 years, I did various things and worked with them, and used to go and I met with Stephen Marshall, I met with David Spears. I did things that started prior to their term and continued over, and had perfectly good dealings, and it's not a problem, I think. Reasonably honest and straight, and I think it's fine.
That's a lovely segue to one of my particular interests, which is the respect for the office, not necessarily versus the incumbent in it, but you wrote a little bit about what your staff and public servants called you when you were a minister. And it is becoming increasingly common for ministers to say to public servants, call me John. And I could just be old and crotchety, and that's fine, but I am actually firmly in the camp where public servants should always call the minister. And I have a reason for that, which is
It's a bit like judges wearing wigs, isn't it?
I think I've worked for about 20 ministers, and regardless of any views that I would never share with anyone about what I thought of the incumbent in it, I work for, respect and deliver for the Minister of the Crown that I work for. And this kind of equalising, it's seen as an egalitarian measure now to not call someone minister, to not say, yes, minister, I'll go and get that for you, or I'll get you some advice on that. I don't think this is an egalitarian system. I don't think that's how the Westminster system works. It's a paramilitary structure, for goodness sake, and we still call them directors general in half the country. And I think that for me, calling someone minister or attorney or premier in all professional circumstances is my delivery for respect for the office that separates out any view I may or may not have about their particular performance or their policy or anything else. And I am keen to swing it back in the other direction and hang on to that view. You were unfussed, I would say, would be my reading of your book, where you were happy one way or the other.
That's true. I don't think I consciously said call me anything in particular, but I noticed some senior public servants would always call me minister. Others just call me John. And I mean, if it was a public event, they would call me minister. I mean, they wouldn't be informal. But you see the CEOs, every day, multiple times a day, you travel together. It'd be odd sitting in an aeroplane having a drink of gin or something, and he says, "Minister, would you like olives with that?" It's not.
Although there are plenty who still do that, John. There are plenty who will sit next to you on a plane or be going into your hotel room side by side, looking tired, and still be saying, "Well, I'll see you in the morning, Minister." So.
Yeah, no, I understand that. And I mean, I think, look, I don't know if I wrote about this, but I certainly think this. I think everybody goes into politics, does it because they want power, right? I think that's fundamentally what it's about. And there's two, and then they can break into two groups. I think the larger group wants power because they want to be able to do things. They're interested in policy outcomes. They're interested in achieving things for a particular group, and they may be bizarre policy positions, or they may be bizarre desires, but they want to do stuff, or stop stuff. But then there's another group, maybe a smaller group, who want power because they want the attributes of power. They want to be called minister. They want to have their car door open. They want somebody to stand up when they come in the room. And I guess I was trying to compare the way I was doing it with those in that category. And I'm aware of one or two of former colleagues who were like that. I don't think they achieved a lot, but they loved the trappings of it. And I wasn't particularly concerned about the trappings, I mean, I loved having a driver, don't get me wrong. I thought the best thing in the world was having a driver. As soon as I left Parliament, as soon as I left the ministry and didn't have a driver, I accumulated speeding tickets hand over fist for the first year until I remembered how to drive again. So I loved that bit of it. And it's good having staff around you. But my personal staff call me John, and they'd always call me minister in a formal setting. But personally, they, I wouldn't expect them to call me anything but my name. There were others who my PA at one stage, I said, "You can call me John," and she said, no minister. And then, she would never call me anything else. And I think in the end she became so worried about it, she didn't call me anything, which is probably harder for her. I do remember talking to the police commissioner once, who rang me about something, and I said, Commissioner, and I said, call me, saying minister, I said, just call me John. He said, yes, minister.
Perfect. See, I wish we were like America and you got to keep your titles.
I was just about to go there, because what do you call a former minister when you run into them? So they've been your minister, you've been in 100 meetings, you've called them minister, you run into them in the central markets and you're like, hello, nope, got nothing. I have had that happen to me a number of times where I'm like, what do I say now?
I've certainly had people subsequently call me minister, and they always giggle. It's just, Well, I think if you don't know what you can call them now, then the formal relation's probably finished, and you need to create a new relationship. Yeah.
I can't. It's so funny. It's such I can't tell you how much of a bodily experience it is.
Oh, I understand.
Yeah. And it is, I think, I love that distinction of why I now have a greater respect for why some ministers do say, call me John, because I hadn't really thought about what you're distinguishing yourself from when you say that, right? Like you are distinguishing yourself from a kind of hierarchical elitist, sort of someone who's in it for the power. But from a public service perspective, the office is what we are honouring and what we are serving.
Sure. No, I get that. I think that's... And
Caroline, we will be the last women standing on this one. There's not a lot of support for our position.
Most public servants, I think, would have called me minister, particularly ones who I didn't meet with frequently. I mean, there were some odd ones who'd come up and say, mate or John or something, and think that's a bit peculiar, I don't know you.
Thank you. Bracing.
But what do you call the CEO? What does the minister call the CEO? Mr. Smith or Director General or Secretary? Calling him CEO is a bit hard.
That's true.
That's very fair. That is very fair. Hey, you should work well.
Director General, but perhaps works because that's a title. But CEO is not something. I suppose you could call them Chief Executive. Yeah.
Secretary's nice though.
Secretary works better. Yeah.
You wrote quite a lot about the personal criticisms of senior public servants in your time in the media and in Parliament, and your need to defend them where they couldn't themselves. Because public servants, once publicly criticised, do not have a right of reply. Right. If someone comes out about a minister and says, I don't like your hair colour or your decision, you jump back on radio and say, well, here's why I did it and here's why I did. For public servants, there's not that right of reply usually. I mean, there are exceptions, etc., but not usually. And in the royal commissions, and particularly Robodebt, but there's been others as well, have shone light on kind of public service practice and decision making, and in turn individual public servants subject to criticism. We've often talked about this challenge of individual accountability in a big government system. Like in a Westminster system of government, the minister's responsible for the big decisions made, and they are often formally delegated down into the department. It is very hard to put your finger on the individual accountability parts of that. How do you reflect, with that kind of bit of removed from that system, how you can do individual accountability in organisations that are so large, and in a system where the minister does carry the can? As we started this podcast, when Caroline talked about the new policy proposal in Cabinet, the Royal Commissioner was like, you put your signature on it, Minister. Like, if there's anything wrong in it, that's yours. How do you kind of reflect on that, the many thousands of individuals and what they're accountable for versus what the minister takes responsibility for?
Well, I suppose the minister is ultimately responsible to Parliament and the Cabinet and to the people. So, I mean, sometimes I made mistakes. I personally made mistakes, said the wrong thing or did the wrong thing. Or I'd always feel bad, really bad about things that I made mistakes in. Always felt really bad. And if I had to, I'd get up in Parliament and express contrition and straighten the record. But if something wrong happened in the department because, somebody misread something or did something, I mean, I feel bad for that person or the person who was the victim of that decision, but I didn't feel bad personally. And so, in terms of accountability, I'd have to get out there and say, well, the department made an error there. We've got independent, the number of times they get independent people in to review, particularly in health, you need that kind of external kind of review. You get them in and then you get a report and saying we won't, we apologise and we won't do it again. I think that system works, and in the public sector, you've got a whole lot of governance arrangements in place, so people are responsible up and down the line for various things. If you've got a good CEO, that should work. I mean, if it's not working, then there's obviously an issue of management that needs to be addressed. But I think, I largely think in the areas that I worked, that those things worked quite well. What I thought was unfair is if something happened and then somebody get up in Parliament and say, oh, it's all yes minister around there, the public servants don't do anything, they do this, or they interfere, like that sort of rhetoric, you'd get a lot. And it's generic like that, it's just political ranting. But sometimes I'd get in and name individuals, and that happened several times in my career, where individuals who are doing, the job they should do were named and criticised really unfairly and personally, for physical attributes or personal attributes that had nothing to do with the nature of the role. And I always felt obliged to get in there and stand up for them because they couldn't do it.
Thanks.
I was just about to say, what a lovely note to finish on, a former minister saying he'd like to get in and stand up for public servants. Thank you so much for your time, John.
Former Minister Hill will be the appropriate language there.
Sorry. Former Minister, that was not very good. Former Minister Hill, it has been absolutely lovely to have you, and it's always nice to hear from ministers valuing the service, and also to make sure that we are hearing from ministers and not just talking ourselves into a circle constantly and anticipating and guessing what ministers want and think, and that we actually find out a bit more directly from the source. So we really appreciate your time
it's true.
today.
Nice to talk to you. And look, I think, the public service is a great jewel. It's the strength, it's the engine that allows ministers to drive and to do stuff. And to not understand that, I think, is something, it's either really stupid or ideologically kind of blind to not really get that. And so you don't want them to be too close, though. I mean, there has to be. They aren't the same thing. Politics is politics. Public service is public service, and to have CEOs who become political, which has happened in the past, or ministers who become just too bureaucratic, which also happens, you've got to avoid both of those. Anyway, they're questions for another day. But
no, they're very good advice, and they will keep all of our listeners thinking. Thank you so much, John. Till next time.
Just some appropriately bureaucratic disclaimers. Those of us in the employ of the state government speak in a strictly personal capacity, consistent with the Public Sector Code of Ethics that permits public servants to promote an outcome in relation to an issue of public interest, in this case, the betterment of the public service. Nothing we say should be taken as representing the views of the government or our employers. While we've tried to be as thorough in our research as busy full-time jobs and lives allow, we definitely don't guarantee that we've got all the details right. Please feel free to email us corrections, episode suggestions or anything else at thewestminstertraditionpod@gmail.com. Thanks to Pampot Audio for our intro and outro music.